Work ethic is the most universally praised character quality in the most available contemporary professional and personal development conversation, the most specifically admired, and the most powerfully rewarded expression of the most available human character, who's most directly productive, and the most genuinely consistent quality, the most available professional culture, the most directly available family systems, and the most powerfully available social institutions most specifically celebrate as the most obvious evidence of the most authentic and the most specifically adequate character's most directly excellent and the most powerfully present expression. We inherit the work ethic narrative early. We inherit it from the most available parents who most specifically praise the most available working hard quality. We inherit it from the most available teachers who most specifically rewarded the most available consistent effort quality. We inherit it from the most available cultural stories that most directly identify the most available strong work ethic as the most specifically adequate and the most powerfully adequate expression of the most genuinely worthy character. And somewhere in the most available inheritance of this most universally praised character quality, most of us most specifically forgot to ask the most foundationally important available question: where does my work ethic actually come from at the most deeply honest level? Not the narrative we have been given about it, the narrative of the most genuine character strength and the most directly adequate expression of the most powerfully worthy personality, the actual developmental origin, the actual engine, the actual functional purpose that the most available work ethic has been most specifically serving in the most genuinely inhabited adult life, not as the most obviously adequate character strength narrative most powerfully and the most specifically suggests, but as the most directly honest and the most powerfully revealing developmental account most specifically and the most compassionately provides. Because for a specific and significant proportion of the most available adults whose work ethic is the most genuinely admired and the most specifically impressive quality of the most available professional and personal life, the most foundationally honest developmental account of the most available work ethic's most characteristic origin is the account of the trauma response, the most specific, the most intelligent, and the most powerfully adequate survival adaptive quality of the developing nervous system's most characteristic response to the most specifically threatening developmental condition of the most available conditional worth environment's most powerfully inadequacy installing quality. This video is not an attack on working hard. The most available misreading of the trauma response framing of the work ethic is the misreading that most specifically interprets the examination of the work ethic's most potential trauma response character as the most directly available and the most powerfully adequate prescription for working less, resting more, and most specifically reducing the most available productive engagement as the most genuinely healing available response. This misreading is not only inaccurate, it is the specific misreading that most directly prevents the most genuinely important and the most powerfully available insight from reaching the person who most specifically needs it. The insight is not that hard work is harmful. The insight is that the most available hard work organized by the most specifically fear-driven and the most powerfully inadequacy avoiding engine is most specifically different in its most daily felt quality, its most genuine sustainability, and its most honestly nourishing capacity from the most available hard work organized by the most specifically authentic engagement and the most powerfully intrinsic motivation, and that the examination of which engine is most specifically driving the most available work ethic is the most genuinely important and the most powerfully life quality determining inquiry available to the most honest and the most compassionately self-examining adult. The trauma-driven work ethic has a specific daily quality from the inside that most directly and the most honestly distinguishes it from the most genuinely adequate and the most powerfully authentic work engagement's most characteristic expression. The most available work is completed, the most significantly pursued, and the most powerfully worked toward quality of the most available productive Output is most specifically and the most genuinely delivered with the most directly adequate and the most powerfully impressive available quality. And the inner experience that accompanies the most available work's most directly adequate completion is not most specifically the most genuinely nourishing and the most powerfully adequate quality of the most authentic satisfactions, most directly present, and the most honestly inhabitable expression. It is the most specifically driven quality, the most directly compelled, the most powerfully unable to genuinely stop, and the most specifically what comes next quality of the most available inner experience that most directly characterizes the trauma driven work, ethics most genuine and the most honestly inhabiting daily quality. The inability to most genuinely stop is the most specifically diagnostic and the most powerfully revealing quality of the most available trauma driven work ethic. The specific quality of the work being most specifically organized, not by the most available authentic engagements, most powerfully present, and the most genuinely willing quality, but by the most specifically fear, organized, and the most powerfully compelled quality of the most available nervous system's most characteristic work as safety encoding. The genuine work ethic, the most specifically authentic and the most powerfully adequate quality of the most available hard work, whose most characteristic driving engine is the most directly intrinsic motivation and the most powerfully genuine engagement with the most specifically valued work quality, is most precisely characterized by the most available three qualities that most directly distinguish it from the trauma-driven work, ethics' most characteristic expression. The first distinguishing quality is the natural stopping capacity, the most specifically adequate and the most powerfully available quality of the genuine work ethics most directly stopping when the most available work is most specifically completed, when the most genuinely adequate rest is most specifically required, or when the most available, more important quality in the most available life most powerfully calls for the most directly adequate attention and the most genuinely present engagement quality. The second distinguishing quality is the genuine absorption quality, the most specifically absorbed and the most powerfully present quality of the most available intrinsically motivated work engagement, whose most directly flow state enabling and the most powerfully genuinely engaging quality is most specifically present as the most naturally available and the most powerfully adequate expression of the most genuine work ethic's most characteristic engaging quality. The third distinguishing quality is the work-life integration ease, the most specifically adequate and the most powerfully available quality of the most genuine work ethics, most directly adequate integration with the most available non-work quality of the most genuinely inhabited life's most powerfully nourishing and the most directly adequate available expressions. The trauma-driven work ethic is most specifically characterized by the most available three opposite qualities: the most specifically compelled inability to genuinely stop, the most directly driven rather than absorbed quality of the most available engagement, and the most powerfully work dominates life rather than work integrates with life quality of the most characteristic daily organization. The first developmental installer of the trauma-driven work ethic is the working parent emotional absence, the most specific, the most durably installing, and the most powerfully work as safety encoding quality of the most available developmental experience in which the most significantly present and the most powerfully modeling quality of the most available primary caregiving environment was most specifically characterized by the most available work as the most directly adequate and the most powerfully adequate quality of the most available parental engagement, communicating through the most powerful developmental modeling quality that the most available work is the most specifically adequate expression of the most available worth, the most directly adequate quality of the most available contribution, and the most powerfully adequate response to the most available, life's most genuinely demanding quality. The working parent emotional absence most specifically installs the trauma-driven work ethic by most directly and the most durably encoding the most available implicit relational knowing system, with the most foundationally organizing developmental lesson that the most available work is the most specifically adequate and the most powerfully adequate quality of the most available human worths, most directly expressing expression, the most directly adequate encoding, producing the most available trauma-driven work ethic as the most specifically adequate and the most powerfully survival relevant available response. The second developmental installer is the achievement conditional acceptance, the most specific, the most durably installing, and the most powerfully work as safety encoding quality of the most available developmental experience, in which the most available primary caregiving relationships, most characteristic quality of the most available warmth, the most directly adequate belonging, and the most powerfully adequate positive regard was most specifically and the most continuously organized around the most available achievement quality rather than the most genuinely unconditional and the most powerfully adequate quality of the most available simply present self's most honestly adequate and the most powerfully sufficient expression. The achievement conditional acceptance most specifically installs the trauma-driven work ethic by most directly and the most durably encoding the most available implicit relational knowing system with the most foundationally organizing developmental lesson that the most available hard work and the most directly impressive achievement are the most specifically adequate and the most powerfully adequate conditions for the most available belonging and the most directly adequate positive regard, the most directly adequate encoding, producing the most available trauma-driven work ethic as the most specifically adequate and the most powerfully survival relevant quality. The third developmental installer is the economic scarcity anxiety modeling, the most specific, the most durably installing, and the most powerfully work as safety encoding quality of the most available developmental experience, in which the most characteristic quality of the most available primary family systems most directly present and the most powerfully organizing emotional climate was most specifically organized around the most available economic scarcity anxiety, whose most directly adequate management, the most available work quality, most powerfully, and the most specifically provided as the most directly adequate and the most powerfully survival relevant available response. The economic scarcity anxiety modeling most specifically installs the trauma driven work ethic by most directly and the most durably encoding the most available implicit relational knowing system with the most foundationally organizing developmental lesson that the most available work is the most specifically adequate and the most powerfully adequate management of the most available scarcity anxieties most directly threatening quality, the most directly adequate encoding, producing the most available trauma-driven work ethic as the most specifically adequate and the most powerfully survival-relevant available response. The work as safety encoding, the specific functional quality of the most available nervous system's most foundationally developmental installation whose most characteristic quality most directly generates the trauma-driven work ethic as the most specifically adequate and the most powerfully survival-relevant available response is most precisely understood as the most directly survival, adaptive quality of the developing nervous system's most characteristic regulatory response to the most specifically threatening developmental condition of the conditional worth environment's most powerfully inadequacy installing quality. The work as safety encoding operates through the most specifically documented and the most directly consequential quality of the most available operant conditioning's most powerfully reinforcement organizing quality, the most available works most specifically reinforced, and the most powerfully consistently reinforced quality of producing the most available relief from the most foundationally feared inadequacies, most characteristic baseline threat signal most specifically, and the most powerfully conditioning the most available nervous system to treat the most available work quality as the most directly adequate and the most powerfully adequate available safety signal. The safety signal quality of the most available work most directly generates the work as safety encoding's most specifically compulsive and the most powerfully unable to genuinely stop quality, the most specifically safety organized, and the most powerfully compulsion generating quality of the most available nervous system's most characteristic treatment of the most available genuine rest as the most specifically dangerous departure from the most available safety signals most directly adequate and the most powerfully adequate quality. The six most specific markers of the trauma-driven work ethic, the six most directly available and the most powerfully revealing qualities that most honestly distinguish the trauma response work as safety encoding from the most genuinely adequate and the most powerfully authentic work engagements. Most characteristic expression include the following most specifically recognizable and the most directly self-examination enabling presentations. The first marker is the inability to genuinely rest without guilt or anxiety. The most specifically compelled and the most powerfully rest, preventing quality of the most available trauma-driven work. Ethics most characteristic rest is dangerous departure from safety signal expression. The second marker is the identity work fusion, the most specifically identity organizing quality of the most available works, most characteristic, not as what I do, but as who I am quality, as the most directly adequate and the most powerfully diagnostic expression of the most available work as safety encoding's most characteristic identity constituting quality. The third marker is the productivity worth equation, the most specifically and the most powerfully worth determining quality of the most available productivity's most characteristic and the most directly worth equating expression as the most directly adequate and the most powerfully diagnostic quality of the most available conditional worth systems, most characteristic productivity as worth evidence organizing quality. The fourth marker is the delegating difficulty, the most specifically and the most powerfully delegating as threatening quality of the most available trauma-driven work ethics, most characteristic, and the most directly control necessary expression as the most directly adequate and the most powerfully diagnostic quality of the most available work safety encoding's most characteristic control necessary for safety quality. The fifth marker is the ill while working quality, the most specifically and the most powerfully continuing to work while physically unwell quality of the most available trauma-driven work ethics, most characteristic safety signal, necessity overriding physical need expression. The sixth marker is the success escalation rather than success satisfaction, the most specifically and the most powerfully standard relocating rather than achievement inhabiting quality of the most available trauma-driven work ethics, most characteristic and the most directly never adequate enough organizing quality. The most compassionate and the most powerfully important quality of this video's most specifically healing enabling available insight is the insight that acknowledges both dimensions of the truth simultaneously, the most specifically real and the most powerfully genuine quality of the work ethic as most directly produced achievements alongside the most specifically real and the most powerfully honest quality of the most available work ethics, most foundationally trauma-driven origin. Both of these qualities are simultaneously true. The work ethic has produced the most genuinely real and the most powerfully adequate quality of the most available achievements. The work ethic is also most specifically organized by the most available conditional worth systems, most foundationally inadequacy fear-driven quality as the most directly adequate and the most powerfully survival relevant available trauma response. The simultaneous truth of these two qualities is the most specifically healing enabling quality because the most honest acknowledgement of the most available work ethics, most foundationally trauma-driven origin, most directly enables the most genuinely compassionate and the most powerfully adequate engagement with what the most available work ethic most specifically requires for the most genuine transformation from the most specifically fear-organized and the most powerfully compelled quality to the most directly authentic and the most powerfully genuinely engaged quality. The breakthrough in the work ethic as trauma response territory is the specific recognition that the most genuinely available and the most powerfully adequate quality of the most available transformation is not the reduction of the work ethic, but the most specific revision of its most foundational driving engine from the most specifically fear organized and the most powerfully compelled quality of the trauma driven work ethic's most characteristic expression to the most directly authentic and the most powerfully genuinely engaged quality of the most available authentic work engagements most specifically value organized and the most powerfully meaningful driving expression. The engine revision most specifically requires the most directly work as safety encoding, addressing, and the most powerfully genuine engagement, building quality of the most authentic practices that most specifically and the most directly address the work as safety encoding at the most foundational level where the most specifically compelled and the most powerfully never adequately satisfied quality most powerfully lives. The first practice is the safety signal audit, the most deliberately maintained and the most specifically work as safety encoding identifying quality of the most authentic honest examination of the most characteristic rest response, the most available identity work fusion quality, and the most directly productivity worth equation quality as the most specifically diagnostic and the most powerfully encoding revealing available expression. The second practice is the genuine engagement cultivation, the most deliberately maintained and the most specifically authentic work, engagement building quality of the most authentic, intrinsically motivated engagement with the most genuinely interesting and the most powerfully value aligned available work quality in the most specifically non evaluative and the most genuinely exploratory available contexts. The third practice is the work decoupled rest, the most deliberately maintained and the most specifically work as safety encoding countering quality of the most authentic, genuine rest practice, whose most directly adequate and the most powerfully rest inhabiting quality, most specifically and the most directly counters the most available work as safety encoding by most specifically providing the most available nervous system with the most genuinely new and the most powerfully revising evidence that the most available genuine rest does not most specifically compromise the most available worth's most genuinely adequate and the most powerfully present quality. The working life beyond the trauma driven work ethics most specifically compelled and the most powerfully never quite satisfied quality is a working life in which the most genuine engagement with the most specifically valued work quality is most directly organized by the most authentic pull toward the most powerfully meaningful available quality, producing the most specifically nourishing and the most powerfully adequate quality of the most available genuine fulfillment as the most directly natural and the most powerfully available consequence of the most authentic work engagements, most specifically value organized, and the most powerfully meaningful driving quality. Your work ethic might be a trauma response from childhood, organized by the worker safety encoding installed through the three developmental installers of the working parent emotional absence, the achievement conditional acceptance, and the economic scarcity anxiety modeling expressed through the six trauma work ethic markers and powered by the nervous system's most characteristic work as safety encoding. The three practices, the safety signal audit, the genuine engagement cultivation, and the worth decoupled rest are the most specifically targeted and the most genuinely engine transforming quality of the most authentic engagement with the trauma driven work ethic at the most foundational level.